I made a video a few weeks ago about the problems I encountered trying to use small and cheap portable power stations to run my 12-volt refrigerator. A number of people said the idea was doomed from the start. Were they right? Let's look at some actual test data and find out. Hi, I'm Gary. I make videos of mostly technology-related subjects that happen to interest me. Hopefully you'll find them interesting too. A couple of months ago, I posted a video that unintentionally got me into a bit of controversy. It was basically my tale of woe about trying to use a small, cheap power station to run my 12-volt fridge for 1 or 2 night camping trips. I ran into a number of issues doing that, from a power station that died completely the first time in the field, to another one whose 12-volt output wouldn't power the fridge adequately because it never quite reached 12 volts, and cloudy weather on one trip rendered my small solar panels helpless. Most of the comments on that video were by people relating their own experience with 12-volt fridges and power stations, which was both interesting and informative. But a fair subset of them included definite opinions about what would or wouldn't work. 3 of the most common opinions could be summed up like this. Because my power stations were not the big-name brands like Jackery or Bluetti, they were cheap Chinese junk, and I should never have expected them to live up to their claimed performance. The power stations I chose were simply not big enough to run the fridge for any useful period of time. And my solar panels were too small to have any hope of keeping a power station charged up. All of these things could indeed be true. When I published the video, I certainly didn't have enough use time to be able to say one way or the other. And even though there are hundreds of YouTube videos discussing or reviewing portable power stations, few, if any, of them contain any actual test data that could have answered these doubts in advance. Certainly not for the specific hardware I bought. So, the aim of this video is not to prove the naysayers are wrong, or right for that matter. It's simply to present some test data that addresses the doubts. To the extent one guy can do this on a shoestring budget in 3 weeks of testing. I apologize in advance for the blizzard of numbers this is going to involve. Quantitative testing is like that. I will try to sum it up at the end if you stick it out. First, there's some things you should know up front that I can't or won't test for. Long-term reliability is not a question I can address. Testing for that on single units would be meaningless. And anyway, I probably won't live long enough to wear one of these things out unless it has a premature failure. Since I spent the last 20 years of my working career writing test procedures and analyzing test data for electric vehicle batteries, I'm all too familiar with the limitations of testing. In this case, the biggest limitations of what I can do are environmental. It's now winter here in Idaho, so I can't subject the fridge to high ambient temperatures, which would certainly increase its power draw. And at 43 degrees north latitude in November, the solar power available here is much reduced compared to summertime in, say, Arizona. And finally, I'm only going to look at DC power usage, because running the fridge off the AC inverters in these power stations would simply waste battery energy. So I wouldn't normally do that, and I don't really care. But I do believe every bit of actual data can contribute to a better understanding of the subject, so here goes. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time talking about how to do battery testing, but you should at least know what choices had to be made. First, all the fridge operation and all the testing was done indoors, around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Second, all power stations claim to have some specific amount of battery energy, but they typically don't specify what manufacturer test conditions that claim is based on. All 3 of mine list only a watt-hour energy rating and an ampere-hour capacity rating for their batteries. The Renogy and the WeTown ones claim the exact same amp-hour capacity, but different watt-hour ratings because their battery voltages are different. Not quite sure how they manage that, since they're both lithium-ion cells, but okay, it's a rating, not a fact. The All-Powers unit claims twice the energy, but a much larger amp-hour rating because its capacity is specified at 3.7 volts. Which probably means they simply spec'd it based on the cell capacity times the number of cells they used. There's no easy way to translate that into a capacity rating at the device output, so I won't. Incidentally, if you watched my earlier video, you may wonder why I have 3 power stations. I bought the Renogy 300 before I even owned the fridge. And the WeTown one was added just as I finished that video. In between those two, the All-Powers unit was supposed to be double their size, so it would run the fridge longer. But its capacity started decreasing from the start, and as I pointed out in that video, it failed completely the first time I took it camping. End of that story. It had been sitting in my basement for a year while I tried to decide how to dispose of it safely without involving fires or explosions. You can't just throw large lithium batteries in the trash. But for no reason whatsoever, I plugged it in and it came back to life. I'm obviously not going to trust it for critical use, but since it's working at the moment, I included it in the testing anyway. Back to testing choices. It's common to test and rate batteries at either constant power or constant current discharge conditions. I did some of both, and I chose to make my discharge tests about 5 hours long, which for the smaller units means a load averaging roughly 50 to 60 watts. The All-Power specs are clearly not based on its DC output voltage, but since it has about twice the battery, I just double those wattage values for testing it. There's really no way of knowing what condition the manufacturers used. Keep in mind that much lower discharge rates would probably result in higher measured capacities. That isn't a huge effect here because a 5-hour discharge really isn't all that demanding. Let's start by addressing that first question. How close do these cheap power stations come to their claimed energy and capacity? I did several discharges on each power station, starting with a full charge, using this very handy little load tester that I bought from Amazon. It doesn't have any calibration adjustments, but I checked its voltage and current readings against the best of my digital multimeters, and they agreed within a couple of % or less, which is good enough for these tests. Here's a table showing the results. You can see that the values do vary some from test to test. The power station battery management systems get to decide when they're fully charged and fully discharged, so there may be some variability there. I'm inclined to take the largest of the measured values as indicative of the battery's actual capacity right now. With that assumption, the Renogy power station delivered 90+% of its watt-hour and ampere-hour ratings, which isn't actually all that bad. It did hit 94% on the lower power test with the fridge, but the WeTown unit managed 102% or more of its ratings on multiple tests, which I find frankly amazing. The All-Powers, of course, has never come close to its 606 watt-hour rating, but something was wrong with it from the time I bought it. However, since it has miraculously come back to life, and I have been exercising it, its capacity has slowly increased to around 85% of rated, depending on the test power level. Do other brands of power stations do better than this? It's entirely possible. I have no data, so I really have no opinion. But the small 300 watt-hour units I have are performing acceptably at this point. So let's go on to question 2. Can a small power station operate a 12-volt fridge long enough to be useful? Keep in mind that my stated goal for this setup was simply to be able to run the refrigerator for 1 or 2 night camping trips. Your goal may be entirely different, but that's my definition of useful. So I set the fridge up in my dining room and loaded it with a couple of gallons of water in various containers, because an empty fridge is not representative of anything. Then I instrumented it with several temperature probes and plugged it into 120-volt household power to cool it down, which is what I always do before taking it on a trip. With the fridge running in max power mode and the thermostat set on 28 degrees, you can see that it took about 7 hours to cool the contents down to a stable value. 12-volt fridges don't circulate the air internally, at least as far as I know, so the temperature varies with location in the fridge. This is a mixed blessing, but in mine you can freeze stuff at the lowest point while keeping drinks and vegetables cool enough in the upper section. I roughly monitored the AC power use during this period. The fridge averaged about 45 watts during the cool down, and only about 11 watts after it stabilized. 8 hours would have been enough time to cool it down, but I ran it this way for 18 hours. Then I switched over to each of the power stations in turn and let them power the fridge in its eco mode as long as they could. I had the fridge under voltage cutoff set on low, but it didn't really matter because the power stations all shut off quite a bit before their output dropped that low. To add a tiny bit of realism, I opened the fridge for a minute or two every couple of hours during the day and took a bottle of water out or put one in. Because it opens at the top, that didn't actually perturb the temperature in the fridge very much. You can see some bobbles in the temperature in the vegetable section, but the temperature of the water in the main chamber didn't really budge when I did this. In fact, almost all the temperature variation is due to the fridge compressor, which only ran about a third of the time in cycles slightly over an hour long. So, given this behavior, how much power did it take, and how long did the power stations last? The WeTown unit powered the fridge for 28¼ hours, while the Renogy lasted a bit longer at 29 hours, both with no recharging, of course. This corresponds to an average power use of slightly less than 11 watts in either case. I'd have to say my Iceco fridge is really energy efficient. At this point, I have no way of knowing how much more energy the fridge would use if the ambient temperature was much hotter. That might call for some more testing of the fridge itself if I can figure out how to get a hot space in the dead of winter. If you have an idea, I'm open to suggestions on that, because I certainly can't heat my house up into the 90s at this time of year. But it does say that under moderate, I'll say fall-like conditions, even my small power stations are good for over a day of operating the fridge. That won't get me 2 full days, of course. Which brings us to the third and final question for this video. How much recharging help can I expect from either of my small solar panels? How do they compare to their ratings? Again, for the benefit of those who haven't seen the earlier video, which I will link in the comments, I have a 50-watt Renogy solar panel that I mount on top of my car on a removable plywood panel like this. The Renogy power station is only rated for 50 watts of charging power, so it seemed a reasonable match at the time. The All Powers unit was rated for 100 watts charging input, so when I bought it, I also got this Cori 100-watt folding unit. The WeTown power station is rated for 3 amps of charging current, corresponding to 36 to 70 watts of solar input, depending on the panel voltage. So it can't actually handle the full rated power of the Cori panel. But the common opinion is that solar panels never produce their rated power, and there is some truth to that. Solar panel ratings are based on standard test conditions that are not achievable just anywhere on planet Earth. Even at high noon on the summer solstice, I couldn't expect to get more than about 70% of the solar power density here in Idaho that you could in the tropics, say. My testing was done in mid-November, with the noon sun only about 30 degrees above the horizon. I connected each of my solar panels to the All Power power station, at about 50% state of charge so that the panel output wouldn't be limited by the power station. That is, if the controller in the power station can actually extract the maximum available power from the panel. To measure the output from the panels, I use this PowerWorks DC watt meter, which measures the voltage, current, and power delivered to a load and integrates the total energy and capacity delivered for whatever time period you have it hooked up. I tested both panels by angling them toward the sun at just about noon. The Renogy panel produced a sustained output of 47 to 48 watts, with a peak value of 49.7, which is 99% of its rating. The maximum sustained value I saw from the Corey panel was only about 66 watts, although the watt meter recorded a peak of 71 watts. That's much less than its rating. But its output voltage is also 2 to 3 volts lower than the Renogy, which could affect how well the controller can extract the maximum power from it. A few days later, I ran another 2 tests by using the all-power unit to load one solar panel and my DC load tester in resistance mode to load the other panel. I varied the resistance of the load tester manually to get as much power from the panel as I could. This effectively made me into a slow-responding solar controller, but it did let me test both solar panels simultaneously. I laid the Renogy 50-watt panel flat on the roof of my motorhome, but with the low sun angle and the 30-foot extension cable I was using, it never produced more than 25 watts. However, I still managed to collect 96 watt-hours in about 4.5 hours. Then I gave up and stood it up, angled more or less at the sun, and managed to collect another 57 watt-hours in an hour and a half. That total of 153 watt-hours is the equivalent of 14 hours of fridge running time under my test conditions. The 100-watt Corey panel has folding supports on the back to stand it up, so even though the angle is not perfect, it was pretty usable that way. Starting at noon, it produced a total of 138 watt-hours in 2 hours and 40 minutes, for an average of 52 watts output. That's almost 13 hours of equivalent fridge running time. If you're still watching, you can unglaze your eyes now. This summary table is the end of the barrage of numbers. What conclusions can one draw from these somewhat scattered but specific sets of test data? My personal conclusion is that either of my cheap 300 watt-hour power stations, with either of my small solar panels, is capable of powering my fridge for the 2 days I was aiming for. If, and yes, this is a requirement, the sun shines at least a few hours on one of the days, and if the weather is not so hot that the fridge power usage goes up a lot. Just how hot is hot and how much is a lot? I don't know of any data that would answer those questions, but I'd like to know. If I can figure out how to heat up the fridge without heating up my whole house, I'll try finding out. Regardless, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like and please consider subscribing to the channel. I hope to see you again.